Hi everyone, my name is Jasmine. If you have never been in my channel before, I cover cases on missing and murdered Indigenous people. And on today's episode of the Slain Project, I'm going to be talking about 3 solved cases from the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. They are Candace Rough Surface, Ivy Archambault, and Natalie White Lightning. And to start this video, I'm going to be talking about the protests at the Dakota Access Pipeline. It is a very important piece of the tribe's history and as a spark in the MMIW movement in the United States. With that being said, let's get right into it. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe are a very strong and resilient people. The women of Standing Rock spearheaded the peaceful protest of the Dakota Access Pipeline, better known as DAPL. Their goal was to stop the construction of the pipeline, advocate for Mother Earth, ensure everybody has clean drinking water, and protect sacred lands. Many were angered because the route of the pipeline construction was diverted from north of Bismarck, North Dakota to south of Bismarck. Meaning, if there was an oil spill, it would affect the Standing Rock Reservation and millions of others downstream. A camp was established called the Sacred Stone Camp near the Cannonball River in April 2016. Hundreds of tribal nations and people from as far away as Australia joined the people of Standing Rock in solidarity. So many supporters showed up that additional overflow encampments were also formed. And even though the protesters, known as water protectors, were peaceful and no weapons were held by the protesters, the local law enforcement bombarded them with pepper spray, rubber bullets, canines, and water cannons in frigid weather. Many of the protesters were arrested for allegations of enticing riots, terrorism, and some were even sent to prison. This scare tactic did not stop the water protectors. They continued to stand their ground until actions in Washington, D.C. stopped the pipeline from being completed. At these camps was a group called No More Stolen Sisters. They are from Canada, where the MMIW movement has been in full swing for many decades. They educated everybody who would listen about man camps. These camps housed the male workers needed to work on pipelines and in the oil fields. The men are often away from their significant others. If you mix in alcohol and/or drug use and the sexual needs of these men, you will see a correlation with rapes, trafficking, and MMIW. The women at the Sacred Stone and surrounding camps were encouraged not to travel alone and to always let someone know where they were going. The Standing Rock gathering was an extremely powerful event. It affected all the people who attended and even those who did not. And with a lot of brilliant minds connecting, a lot of grassroots groups were formed. There was MMIW awareness in the United States before this, but in the aftermath of the protests, the awareness began to spread even more so. There are a lot of MMIW cases from the Standing Rock Reservation. These are only 3 stories that have some sort of resolution. And I say it that way because some of these sentences the offenders received is a joke. And I have said this before and I want to say it again. Our women are not vulnerable, but are moving targets. We are not safe on or off of our reservations. Candace Rough Surface. Candace was 18 years old and had a 2-year-old son. They lived in Kennel, South Dakota. According to her family, she was last seen by them on Saturday, August 2nd, 1980. They said she cashed a check and went grocery shopping in the nearby town of Mobridge. Mobridge is off of the reservation and just on the other side of the Missouri River, about a 30-minute drive from Kennel. It was never stated if she drove herself or caught a ride with someone to Mobridge. But after she was done shopping, she went back home to the res for a little bit. She returned to Mobridge later in the evening and met her sister Clara at a downtown bar. She then left and went to another local bar called Joker's Wild. Even though Candace was only 18, at the time in 1980, she was allowed to drink Low Point beer at this bar. Candace would disappear after this night and no one would see her alive again. Her mother, Alberta, would report her missing on Tuesday, August 5th, 1980. Her family waited in agony for 9 months before her remains were found. On Tuesday, May 19th, 1981, a rancher found her body in the receding waters of the Missouri River near Mobridge. The river had dried up enough to make her body visible. She was severely decomposed and she was shot 5 times with a .22 caliber rifle, 3 times in the head and 2 times in the back. In October 1995, 15 years after Candace's murder, 2 men would be charged with the crime. A man from Wisconsin named James Stroh II was going through a bitter divorce. Before he married his wife, he had told her a story about him and his cousin Nicholas Schur, who lived in Mobridge, South Dakota. He told her that they had murdered a native girl there long ago when they were teenagers. During the divorce, James's wife told her mom the story. She worked for a lawyer and then told him the story, and he notified law enforcement. James Stroh would eventually testify against his cousin Nick. I am going to recount what James said happened that night. I personally think that his recollection is true for the most part, but he seems to be full of shit in some places. It seems as if he is trying to downplay his involvement in Candace's murder and blame it all on his cousin Nick. It would be learned that Candace would encounter the 2 teenage cousins sometime after leaving one of the downtown bars the last night she was seen alive. Nicholas Schur was 16 and his cousin James Stroh was 15 at the time and was visiting on vacation. James said that him and his cousin Nicholas met Candace outside of a bar that night in 1980. They also were drinking that night. According to him, she was drunk and he thought she was looking for sex. She most likely was not, and she could have just wanted to hang out, or maybe they even promised to take her home. But they all ended up at a mobile home trailer. James first told investigators that several other teenage boys were there. But in a taped phone call recording between him and Nick, it would be revealed that it was only the 2 cousins and Candace. He went on to say that Candace had rejected some sexual advances and was upset. So they all left the trailer in Nick's pickup truck. Candace then supposedly hit Nick while he was driving, and this angered him. Nick then pulled over and drug her out of the truck, beat and raped her. When Nicholas was done with his violent attack on Candace, James said that his cousin forced him to do the same to Candace. Then Nicholas repeated the act when James was finished. James claimed that this was done because Nick said that they were in this together. Nick then ordered James to grab his rifle from the back of his truck. James claims he was scared and did not do it. So Nick grabbed it and shot Candace. He then made his cousin do the same thing. Up to this point, it is all very terrifying, but these 2 assholes were not done yet. They then wrapped a chain around a now deceased Candace and used the truck to drag her into the Missouri River. She would stay in her watery grave until she surfaced 9 months later. In May 1996, Nicholas Schur would take a last-minute plea deal. The charge of first-degree murder was downgraded to first-degree manslaughter, and he would be sentenced to 100 years. The rape charges against him were dropped due to the statute of limitations. A part of his plea deal allowed him to be considered for parole only after 13 years. He was denied parole the first time, but was released from prison in May 2019, after spending only 23 years in prison. His cousin, James Stroh, agreed to a plea deal of second-degree manslaughter and aggravated assault. He did not have to go to trial because he testified against his cousin. He was sentenced to 15 years and was paroled in 2004. Candace's murderers were brought to justice, but the outcome was not ideal. Ivy Archambault. Ivy was 31 years old, single, and lived in McLaughlin. She had just earned a bachelor's degree and was a social worker. Her sister, Anna Long Chase, described her as a nice, quiet, sweet Christian girl who loved animals. Her traditional Indian name was Pretty Bird Woman. Ivy lived in an area called the Bear Soldier Housing District, and in late September and early October of 2001, there had been a string of break-ins. 3 other single women had their homes broken into in the middle of the night. The burglar fled in all 3 instances before anyone could get a good look at him. No one was hurt in the break-ins until it was Ivy's turn. Ivy was last seen at her job on Thursday, October 4th, 2001. She did not show up for work the next day on October 5th. Her boss knew Ivy as a very reliable person and grew concerned. The boss called Ivy's family and the police were soon notified. Ivy had a meetup with her brother planned on Saturday the 6th, which she also missed. And she was a no-show to work on Monday the 8th. It was not stated in the newspaper archives that her family went to her home during the weekend, but my best guess is that they did, because reports say that her home was found burglarized. Ivy and her car were nowhere to be found. The car would turn up near Rapid City on Sunday, October 7th. This is 235 miles away from McLaughlin. It is stated that her car ran out of gas and a male juvenile was fleeing the scene. From what I can gather, this individual pointed investigators in the direction of Ivy's body. Her remains would be discovered on October 11th, about 4 miles south of the town of Newell, South Dakota. It is said a ground search was conducted based on leads that had been received. At the time, all investigators said is that she was a victim of a crime. The next day, they would arrest 16-year-old Gary Long Jr. in connection with Ivy's murder. It is said that Gary had broken into Ivy's car before he entered her basement window. He then raped her, then took her and left in her car towards the Black Hills. When they got to the spot where she was found, he beat her to death with a tree branch. It was also revealed that Gary came from an alcoholic home and witnessed his brother commit suicide. I know it is not an excuse for his actions, but growing up in such a way can have traumatizing effects on a person. I grew up in an alcoholic home and know way too well all of the things that happen in such a place. Many children who come from such homes do not escape the grip of alcohol and become dependent on it themselves. In July 2002, a grand jury would indict him on 4 counts. Number 1, kidnap resultant in death. Number 2, aggravated sexual abuse by force. Number 3, first-degree burglary. Number 4, larceny. Gary Long Jr. would plead guilty to these charges on December 18, 2002. He received 45 years in prison. He tried unsuccessfully to escape from prison on 2 separate occasions. He will be approximately 60 years old when he is released. Natalie White Lightning. Natalie was 38 years old and lived in Cannonball, North Dakota. She was a loving person who liked to help out other people and was employed at Prairie Knights Casino. Natalie had a 15-year-old son named Adam. He unfortunately died about 4 months before she did on November 22, 2013. This may have caused Natalie to drink more than she usually did. Natalie was last seen by her friends around Monday, March 17, 2014. Court documents say that Natalie was drinking heavily the night she was last seen alive and was unconscious when a man named Lance Summers had his way with her. It is not clear where this happened at. Natalie lived in Cannonball, so maybe it was Lance's place. But Natalie moved back and forth between Cannonball and Fort Yates, so maybe she also lived there too. Lance was 29 years old at the time, and during the assault, he began to choke her with one of his hands. Natalie would die as a result of this. A 17-year-old boy was also present during this, and when they realized she was not breathing, she was moved to a field in Fort Yates. Lance and this 17-year-old were also drinking at the time. An unsealed court affidavit said that Fort Yates police received a call in the early morning hours of March 18th, and they believed the caller was Lance. The person reported that there was an unresponsive female lying in a field. This would be the same location where Natalie would eventually be found at. When the police showed up, Lance and the 17-year-old took off running. There was a foot chase and both were caught. The juvenile was crying and told police, quote, "There is a woman out there." And that, quote, "Natalie is still out there," end quote. Officers searched briefly in the darkness but saw nothing. In the cop car, Lance was heard telling the 17-year-old not to say anything. I am unsure if these two were held in jail. Natalie probably had not been reported missing yet. Her body would later be found in this same field on April 22nd, 2014, just over a month after she was last seen. Two people were walking through the field when they stumbled across her body. I question why the police did not go back during the daylight hours to check for a body after they encountered Lance and the 17-year-old. Natalie's autopsy could not determine her cause of death, but they said contributing factors were suffocation, hypothermia, and alcohol intoxication. I am not a medical expert, but it seems like suffocation should have been listed as the likely cause. Lance was charged with second-degree murder and sexual abuse of Natalie. This charge could have led to a life sentence, and he initially pled not guilty. But the prosecution had growing fears that a jury would not believe the testimony of the 17-year-old witness. They offered Lance a plea deal that would give him only 10 years in prison. In November 2015, Lance took this deal and received his 10-year sentence and 5 years probation after his release. This was hardly anything for a life that was taken. And that's all the information I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and if you knew any of these victims, please share any memories of them down below. And I hope to see you in the next video.